Chapter 2. Summer of 1913.
If you're cheating like that again, you can't play with us anymore,
Isabella shouted angrily.
I didn't cheat.
Basil protested his innocence.
I just changed my hiding spot.
He pointed toward the left side of the street.
Look, over there, behind the tree.
Basil and Isabella were amongst a bunch of neighborhood kids playing hide and seek on the streets near his home. They were a colorful bunch, with Isabella being the oldest and the bossiest. She was 13, going on 30.
I'm the oldest here, and so I decide where we'll play,
she often stated, squinting behind her thick glasses. And boy, did she love to boss Basil about. She always accused him of being a cheat, but secretly, she loved his attention. For she had a huge crush on him. Basil was a year younger than Isabella, and like the other kids, his time was spent playing all sorts of fun games like hopscotch, marbles, or even chasey whenever he could. But when there were enough kids around the neighborhood, their favorite game of all time was playing hide and seek in the dark woods of the Chelsea Gardens. It was a gloriously sunny day one Friday after school, and along with all the other kids, Basil was busily preoccupied with playing a long game of hide and seek.
You have 60 seconds to hide,
Isabella shouted, her red bushy hair blowing in the warm summer breeze.
Starting now!
And like lightning, Basil zipped across the street to hide quickly. Yet something peculiar, out the corner of his eye, caught his attention. He turned to see a tall man dressed in a very tidy, double-breasted suit, walking toward him, a resemblance very much like that of his father. Shielding his eyes from the sun's bright rays, Basil got a better look. Yes, indeed, it was his father, Mr. Gregor Duclain. Basil wondered why his father was home at this hour, because usually he wasn't, for he worked the long hours of a publican, owning a magnificent stone pub called the Templars Inn.
Lad, you're to be home by 4:30, no later. Understood?
Spoke Mr. Duclain sternly, his piercing brown eyes staring.
Yes, sir, I understand,
Basil replied, nodding his head quickly.
I shall not be late.
And without so much as a goodbye, Mr. Duclain turned on his heel and wandered away. The other neighborhood kids crawled out from their hiding spots and slowly crept towards Basil's side. To them, Mr. Duclain was the scary man that never smiled.
Why doesn't your dad let you play with us longer?
Daffy looked up at Basil, one of the smaller hide-and-seek participants.
I don't know.
Basil mumbled, embarrassed, kicking a pebble at his feet. He, too, wondered why.
Hey!
A loud voice jeered from behind them all. Startled, Basil and the others whipped their heads over their shoulders. It was the jolly Maud O'Mittenthorpe, flapping his hands about and frantically running up the street to greet them. Basil perked up and smiled excitedly. Maud was his greatest friend in the whole wide world.
Hey, Maud!
He cried happily, quickly forgetting the awkward encounter with his father.
What took you so long?
Maud lived on the other side of Chelsea, about an hour's walk away over the old Red Bridge. And like Basil, he was also 12 years old. They had been practically best friends since their first day of school. Lanky and tall, Maud was tanned with cropped blonde hair and had eyes the color of an azure ocean, just like his sweet mother's Lucy. Maud's mother adored Basil, and when he visited, she always fed him whipped cream and raspberry jam on fresh bread. But sadly, Basil had not visited Maud's house in a very long time. For some inexplicable reason, his father seldom allowed him to go there, or anywhere, for that matter.
Well, look what I found today.
He rushed straight over to Basil with what appeared to be 2 tin cans laced with a length of string that poked through the center of them both. All the kids swarmed around Maud to see what all the fuss was about. Maud swelled, feeling the envy grow thick amongst them, and thus took advantage of the attention.
It can be used for lots of different things.
He informed them matter-of-factly.
But the best thing of all is that it can be used to catch fish in the stream down by the dark woods.
Oh, come on, Maud! Isabella rolled her eyes, folding her arms across her chest.
The fish can easily jump out of that. They're just too slippery, silly. They'll just fall out.
Maud couldn't stand Isabella.
Oh, yeah, right, Isabella.
He mocked.
And what do you know about fishing anyway?
My papa does it all the time.
She answered with her hands on her hips, stepping closer to Maud.
In Brighton. He taught me everything I need to know about fishing.
She eyed Basil, and Basil quickly shunned away from her domineering glance, hoping to avoid any awkward confrontation with her. She then dramatically threw her arms up in the air.
Oh, I'm so bored with the same old hiding spots. Do let's go to the fields that Thomas Bartley told me of, somewhere past the dark woods.
Most of the kids agreed that they too were bored of the same old hiding spots, and were eager to try somewhere new. So off they all trotted down toward the dark woods. Upon arrival, they shrieked gleefully when the unexplored fields drew closer to them.
Oh, Thomas Bartley was so right!
Isabella shouted excitedly, running through the acres of open fields woven with high bushy oak grass, fallen logs, and wild oak trees. It was the perfect place for endless hide-and-seek fun, and Basil, just this once, had to agree with her. As the hours swiftly passed them by, getting lost within their frolicsome fun and fancy-free, it suddenly dawned on Basil that he had no idea what time it was. The pit of his stomach dropped as he glanced up into the rich coral skies, watching the sun melting into the west. He knew it was late, and he remembered the solemn word he gave his father. His body shuddered all over. He rushed through the grass to find Maud. Finally, he spotted him.
I have to go now!
He frantically shouted out to him from afar. Maud quickly ran into Basil's direction.
Baz! Wait!
He hollered, disappointment glazing his face. Puffing, he quickly reached Basil.
Why? Why now, Baz? Tomorrow's Sunday. I told my father I'd be home by 4:30.
Panting with his hands on his hips, Maud glared at Basil worrisomely, for he too knew the harsh manner of Basil's father should he disobey.
Then you better go now.
Maud nodded hurriedly.
So I'll see you tomorrow then, yeah? Yeah.
Basil turned on his heel.
See ya.
Wasting no time, Basil dashed through the fields back toward the dark woods as fast as his strong young legs would take him. And whilst the other kids continued prancing and playing about happily, Maud stood still, watching Basil's body grow smaller and smaller in the distance. He worried for his best friend. Basil's boots thumped along the pavement, and he glanced into the dying sunset, watching the day fade into night. And despite his best efforts, he reached home 2 hours late. Wet with sweat, he quietly scampered up the garden path and onto the front veranda, hoping his father hadn't seen him. He quickly peeked through the living room window, glimpsing the outline of his father, relaxing in his favorite armchair, smoking his pipe. Relieved, Basil hastily sat down to unlace his boots. His feet were hot and musty, and he couldn't wait to get them off. Becoming vaguely distracted by some voices of kids laughing down the street, his mind began to drift through his anxious thoughts.
Maybe he'll be okay tonight. It's Friday night. Surely he'll be in a good mood.
Untying the double knot of his boots, angst slowly crawled over his skin until the butterflies began fluttering uncontrollably within his stomach. And it was at that very moment that he wished he would just simply disappear. Home life had never been a happy one for Basil. Cold, lifeless, and despondent, he often dreamed that he was allowed to sleep at school, so he wouldn't have to go home to his father each night. Instead of learning, Basil's school day was typically consumed by dread, knowing he'd have to go home as soon as that school bell rang. All Basil ever wanted was his father's love and acceptance. He yearned for it, and yet, in all his young 12 years, had never once received it, ever. Gregor Duclane was a highly unpredictable man with terrible mood swings, and as a result, Basil was constantly walking on eggshells. He just wanted to be normal. He wanted to have a mother like Maud did. He wanted someone to make him nice food, like bread and butter pudding and poached eggs on toast. Suddenly, Basil's thoughts were abruptly torn away from his mind as he felt an excruciating pain slice into his throat, violently cutting off his breath. It was a terrible pain, like nothing he had ever experienced before. Desperately gasping for air, he realized his body was lifting off the veranda.
What did I tell you, lad?
A low voice growled in his ears. Basil's sight grew dim.
I said 4:30, didn't I?
All of a sudden, Basil was hurtling through the air and thudded onto the carpet of the living room, scraping his knees as he landed. And despite his dizziness, the immediate relief of oxygen filling his lungs was enormous, but it wasn't to last. His father slammed the door shut with such a force that the hinges jumped out of their sockets.
Tell me what I said!
He roared. Fear ripped through Basil's body, watching his father glaring back down at him. He was about to unleash hell.
I'm sorry, Father.
Basil stammered through his trembling.
I lost track of the time. I'm sorry. You don't respect my authority.
His father sputtered, wedging a foot on either side of Basil's waist, unable to escape his pouring wrath.
I do, Father. I do. I'm sorry. I won't do it again. Ha!
His father seethed wickedly.
No, you bloody well won't.
Basil's heart went numb, staring deep into his father's black pupils, overcome with desperate sadness. He wondered why his father hated him so much. Silent tears of despair streamed from the corners of his eyes, rolling down into his matted hairline. He knew what was coming next.
I have to get out of here.
Basil frantically tried to fight his way out of his father's hefty foot grasp, but he just couldn't match his father's strength. He almost got out of it, until his father slapped him with a hand as hard as steel.
Don't even think about it, you bastard child!
Basil's head was smacked back down against the floor, with a ringing in his ears that was unbearable. Any words that rolled from his father's nasty tongue from then onward were muted instantly. An uncontrollable fear was consuming Basil by the second, and he didn't know how much more he could take living like this, and even worse. He couldn't believe he had to call this man his father.
Please, Father!
Basil cried, choking on his words.
I beg you, Father, no more! Oh, I know you won't do it again.
His father grabbed him by the ear with his big callous fingers.
You ungrateful little prick!
Sobbing heavily, Basil squeezed his eyes shut, hoping his father would just disappear. The pain he felt in his body could not even compare to the pain he felt within his heart. So much pain that he thought he would explode.
I hate you!
Basil screamed through his inconsolable wailing, his face swelling with redness. Now he had done it. He watched his father's veins burst through his neck until he morphed into a monster.
You rubbish son!
His father growled, lurching his face against Basil's.
I work and give you everything! You and your dirty whore of a mother are your own breed of filth. Be damned with you!
The alcoholic stench on his father's breath was putrid, but naturally, this was nothing new to Basil, as he had been spat on 1,000 times before. Suddenly, he was wrested up to his feet and dragged upstairs. Groveling and wrestling with each other, they eventually stumbled into Basil's bedroom. And with a flicker of hope, Basil leaped onto his bed and lunged towards the glass of his window, willing to make a frightening, yet more than likely, fatal escape. But it was not to be so, for his father was much too quick, yanking him by the ankle back onto his bed blankets.
Mrs. Chili!
Basil screamed with inexplicable terror, ripping the curtains from the window, feeling as they crashed down on top of his head.
Help me! You think old Mrs. Tilly is going to rescue you?
His father sneered, dragging him to the floor.
You have no one! You need to be a man, and I'm going to make one of you, so get used to it!
Basil's frightened tears streamed down his swollen face. He was beyond devastated, and sadly, his father was right. He had no one. He felt himself die inside. Abruptly, Basil felt his button shirt torn away from his body. His heart skipped a beat. He listened to the clanking of his father's silver belt buckle, slipping away from his trousers. Basil didn't dare turn around. Instead, he quickly buried his face deep inside the refuge of his bed blankets, terrified that he would die tonight. Basil surmised within his mind that surely by now he would have grown accustomed to the belt's painful wrath. He thought with age he would have, but he hadn't. His heart was far too gentle. He urgently shoved the blankets into his mouth, biting down on them as hard as he could, praying that he would just vanish out of existence. He felt the swift, cool draft of air of the leather belt lifting high above his father's head, until the excruciating pain of its silver buckle sunk into his atrociously scarred back, feeling it tear through his skin like 1,000 blades. His head spun like a wheel, and his whole body burned with fire.
You shan't ever take my word for granted again!
His father roared, engulfing the summer night air. Basil could feel the blood dripping down the side of his waist, and even worse, the fresh scabs from a previous beating the week before had reopened. And sadly enough, Basil could not even remember the last time when he didn't see blood on his clothing. The draft of air was icy against his open back, feeling the belt lifting once more and whipped against his flesh. Basil cried from the depths of his soul.
This will teach you to respect my authority!
His father seethed, glaring down at Basil's bloodied body without remorse, lost in his own insane world. Riddled within so much searing pain, Basil could take no more. He was exhausted. His heart was exhausted. He wanted out. Basil had never been introduced to God, but he prayed that a miracle would happen, so he would never have to see his wicked father's face ever again. Chapter 3. Basil groggily woke up in the wee hours of the next morning. In fact, it was so early that he could barely see the trees outside his window in the front garden. All was dark and eerily quiet. He had almost forgotten what had ensued the night before, until he noticed his legs tangled up within the bedroom curtains, laying in a mess beside him. Without warning, a horrid flash of his father's menacing face pierced his mind and quickly rattled his bones.
I'm still alive,
he whispered, glancing the outline of his bare torso. He rolled over and cringed with pain when he realized his bloodied back was stuck to the bedsheets. Pushing through the agony, he slowly sat up, listening to his gentle breath, the only sound throughout the dark morning stillness. Very carefully, he peeked through the bedroom window, down at Mrs. Tilly's house. Her curtains were drawn and her house dark, just as all the other houses were along the street. The terror of last night slowly began seeping through Basil's eyesight as he scanned his bedroom, searching for his father's looming presence. Thankfully, his father was nowhere in sight. He sighed with relief. As the light of a morning dawn began to slither through his window, Basil sat on the edge of his bed, feeling like death. He was weak and in a lot of pain, and he knew he needed help. Out the corner of his eye, he spotted his father's brown leather belt, lying in the corner of his bedroom, and stared at its silver buckle speckled with blood.
How something so small can cause so much pain.
He jolted upright, suddenly becoming distracted by the deep snoring of his father downstairs. A scary, yet tantalizing thought popped into his mind, and his heart began thumping.
I must run away,
he whispered to himself, trembling with anxiety.
I must.
Basil knew that his only chance of escaping would be now. For listening to the slumberous state of his father, no time would be better or safer. Bursting with nerves, he delicately tiptoed over to his wooden set of drawers and carefully started throwing on layers and layers of clothes. He was leaving nothing to chance. It was as if his arms and legs had a mind of their own. He was finally leaping into the unimaginable, the unthinkable. Basil was going to make a run for it, and it felt incredible. Flogging after flogging, year after year, Basil dreamed of this moment forever. He dreamed of disappearing, of running away, but the fear of his father catching him crippled him enough to forget it. He knew his father would undoubtedly kill him, should he ever get caught. But within his tender heart, Basil also knew that eventually his father would kill him if he stayed. He quietly crept out of his bedroom, listening to the deep guttural grunts downstairs, and tiptoed into his father's bedroom, knowing full well there was a bunch of silver on his bedroom dresser. Already feeling sickly, the putrid smell of stale smoke and ale wafting through his nasal passages almost had him topple over. Seldom was the occasion that Basil actually entered his father's bedroom, but seeing it now was a ghastly sight. Dirty clothes were scattered all over the floor, shoes thrown across the room, moldy plates of food were piled on top of every surface in sight. Yet through the disgusting dross, Basil's eyes gradually fell over the imminent treasure. The bedroom dresser, laden with silver, covered in tobacco ash, and a white powdery substance.
Looks to be well over 10 shillings here.
Nervously peering over his shoulder, he crept closer. He grabbed a dirty sock from his father's bed and began to drop silver into it. Filling it quickly, he grabbed another, and then another, until he was satisfied that he had acquired enough loot without the socks tearing. As he was about to leave his father's bedroom, his attention was drawn to the rhythmic ticking of a pendulum clock in the corner. of the room. He watched it quietly for a moment, getting lost within the hypnotic rhythm of the bronze pendulum, swaying from side to side. Closing his eyes, he inhaled deeply.
There's absolutely no turning back now.
He carefully crept back into his bedroom and hurriedly laced up his old black boots. The time had come. He glanced around his bedroom for the last time, feeling a sadness shade over his sore body. This had been his only place of solace.
Goodbye, my little room,
he murmured, swallowing the painful lump forming in his throat. Basil's true test of courage was about to begin. His stomach fluttered as his shaky boots made their final descent downstairs. Hearing the intermittent snores of his father growing louder and louder, stiffening his broken heart with wretched fear again. His palms became clammy, holding those heavy socks, and he prayed they wouldn't dare make a sound. Down and down and down he went. His arms began trembling, and his knees shook.
keep calm.
But Basil couldn't keep calm. He couldn't believe what he was doing. And despite his buckling fear, his feet kept moving, as if a higher power was forcing them forward. Walking through the living room, Basil glimpsed a liquor bottle smashed to pieces on the floorboards beside the stone wall. And then at long last, sprawled over the living room rug, was his father, with his trousers smothered in tobacco ash. Terror sliced through Basil's heart at seeing his father again. And just before he fainted from fright, he thrust himself through to the kitchen. This moment was literally life or death for him now, and making a run for it was his only chance at life. Watching his drunken father like an eagle watches his prey, Basil slithered toward the back door of the kitchen. Suddenly, his father stirred. Basil's heart skipped a beat. He whipped his head over his shoulder, hoping his father couldn't hear the deafening sounds of the blood throbbing through his veins. He knew he was running out of time, and fast. Fighting through his aching body, he grabbed an empty Hessian potato sack beside the back door and delicately placed the stuffed socks of silver inside, and just for good measure, grabbed the stale block of cheese left on the kitchen stove and shoved that inside as well. Turning the handle of the kitchen door ever so quietly, Basil took one last look at his snoring father, hoping he would never have to lay eyes on him in this life again. He quickly hobbled down the step and into the streaming sunlight of the dawn, becoming engulfed within a rush of warm summer air, making him smile. He wandered around the side of the house toward the front veranda and, carefully standing on his tippy toes, peered through the living room window one last time, relieved to see that his father had not moved an inch. Stopping on the street path beside his front garden, Basil glanced back at his house. Not an ounce of him was going to miss 66 Leicester Street. He took a deep breath, turned, and staggered off as fast as his little bruised legs would take him. He ran through the fresh morning air, beaming with a smile so big that he thought his jaw would snap. The immense pain felt all over his body. The aching ribs, the bleeding wounds dripping down his back could not even remotely hinder his stride, for the amount of happiness swelling within him was inexplicable.
At last, I'm free!
He cried with glee inside his mind. Yes, it was true. Basil was free. Free as the blossoms blowing through the wind. Free as the blackbird soaring in the deep blue skies. Free from all the pain, the sadness and torment that had consumed him every single day from as far back as he could remember, and to never, ever see his father again was the biggest freedom of all. Basil ran through the muddy pathways of Chelsea, down into the grass and amongst the yellow soursops. He ran down along the gully streams, passing the dark woods. He ran over the Red Bridge. He ran and ran and ran, and never looked